I think in our development approach, it's a wake-up call for climate change, because climate change is impacting us in terms of both slow onset events and also extreme catastrophic events. We haven't talked about the slow onset events and so on, like in farming, agriculture, seasonality, and other things, or sea level rise. But we talked about disasters and extreme events. But we need to look at both, aspects or that perspective. And if climate change is going to live with us, at least in not only our generations, in future and so and so, I think it's time to think about development approaches. What I'm getting at is basically, to be very brief and short, that in Canada, we have CEPA, Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So every single development projects, public, private, need to go through EIA. It is time, I agree with Judy's, but I want to push it a little bit more, that we not only need to have emergency management profession, but also we need to push and put in the public policy agenda that it's time for environmental and climate risk assessment in every major development projects. In that way, we can address the issue in terms of capacity. We can address the issue of risk reduction. And then, given emergencies, we can prepare ourselves of who should respond and how collaboratively we can handle it. Thank you. Steve, any comment on you? Do you have any comment on it?
Just quickly, that response is all we do, and it has been like that. We talk about mitigation, resilience, and all of that stuff, but that's just for talking. In 1942, Gilbert White wrote a book. The title was Adjusting to Floods. In 1942, and we are still doing the same thing. We just keep changing the names we call it. We will say mitigation, we say resilience, then we say adaptation, but and then we go back to our offices and don't put the money where the mouth is. And that is what, so my frustration is exactly the same. We just keep on doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
I'm going to disagree a little bit, which is, we heard both yesterday from Johanna Bota about floods that occurred in Manitoba that famously led to stories that Chris told us about, leading to massive amounts of damage, and then similar water flows more recently not having any much damage at all. So it seems to be the case that Manitoba has done some work to adapt and mitigate. And in Jody's presentation today, she mentioned that Alberta has moved people away from floodplains, that they did not, building back better did occur by not building back in the spots that are dangerous. So I do think that there's a need to think seriously about what can be done, what is being done on the other phases of emergency management besides the response. I think the military would love if the conversation moved from response to other things, because it's not their job. And so I do think we need to think about these other phases. The challenge, I've already put them down and Niru before we started talking this morning, is what is the focus of this team for the next 3 years? And I am completely agnostic about that. It's up to them to figure out what they care about, what research they think is achievable over the next, 2.5 years now that we're into this. But I do think, in terms of the question that Chris raises here, I think he's spot on about this need to think about the different phases, and that allows us to think about different actors mattering at different points of the process. I have lots of comments about everything else that's happened the past days, but I need to save some of that for my few minutes at the end of the day. And we'll see where the conversation of the next hour and a half goes, and I'll come back to some of that. But I'd like to hear more from the audience about the directions to Chris's response or to other things that we have. Major need representing everybody in uniform.
Perfect, thank you. So 2 questions I'd like to pose to the committee and everyone who's in attendance. And it's sort of, we're talking about how we want to reduce dependence on the military for a domestic response for a natural emergency. And something that I would offer for consideration and is started and I think needs to be reinforced is the education at a political level, and that I'm talking at the municipal, provincial, and even federal level on how to respond and what the responses, what the limitations and the impacts are for using the Canadian Armed Forces. And that sort of leads into my presentation, where one of my roles as the liaison officer to the province is try to educate everyone at the provincial level and at the municipal level what the impacts are for using the Canadian Armed Forces. Because sometimes they just might not know, and that's totally fine. That's not their role, but I will try to make it as easy as possible for them to make the best decision. And we can probably, push that as much as we can. And the next one is the financial accounting. Because when it comes down to it, the government, one of the key resources is how much money they can throw at a problem. And I don't know specifically what the answer is compared to what is the cost of using the military compared to what's the cost of contracting a civilian solution, or what are the long-term benefits for the risk and hazard identification and mitigation plans compared to the response plans. But that might be something that we could consider putting some thought towards. I personally don't have the time for it, but I know there might be people who are more qualified to do that study. That's thank you.
I think with the next one, the last point is very, very critical. The financial cost is obviously, come to the very forefront because we are talking about public funds, public finance. So it's not only just in the Canadian context, in the context of United Nations, also in the context of a specific country, it's very valuable. I all the time to my students and peer groups and other colleagues, I insist exactly that's what we should do. What's the most cost effective? But it's also not only economic, but also we need to look into other considerations as well. That opportunity cost, that what we heard, from the former deputy minister.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I would rather like to thank the organizers and all the presenters. It was a great event. So my question was that what if there is an approach which is integrated with each other, like it intersects in each and every aspect? Suppose the same agency is working for fire or fire-related hazard, and the same agency is working for the flood-related hazards, or as I'm not mentioning disaster because it's socially constructed, as ma'am said just a few minutes ago. So what if this training is much more, I don't know how to term it, like all-in-one approach that in the civilian organization and also in military, there should be training which is quite integrated. So everyone knows that, okay, I have to do this, I have to do that. So this is my question towards the speakers. Would it make it much more cost effective and efficient? Because in disasters, we have to be efficient and also cost effective. And this is also in terms of sustainability and what we are focusing on currently now. So this was my question.
I'm not sure in the Canadian context specifically, but the United Nations Development Program will say that prevention is about 7 times more cost effective than response, generally speaking. So if we take those figures broadly the same, we get a very intuitive understanding that the effort put before the event is actually much more cost effective and efficient. The problem, I think, becomes efficiency is really going to depend on who's doing the accounting. The current model is very efficient if you're a province. You don't have to pay for some parts of the response. You have to pay for a lot of the prevention, but you're not necessarily in extremis having to pay for this logistical support, this, the staffing kind of shows up on your doorstep. So it is very efficient. Why would a province necessarily want to change that? So I think one of the aspects that is lacking in Canada right now for many good reasons is an actual framework of ownership of this problem. It's already, when we talk about multi-stakeholder, the truth is it's multi-owner, right? It's multi-owned across sectors, across provinces, across levels. And it's very difficult to therefore have a national approach. There are national risk registers, there's national kind of indexes of things, but there's not actually a top-down vision for how this will be done. And we've talked about all the good reasons for that. That makes it very difficult to have sweeping one-size-fits-all approaches because they're just not going to, there's no mechanism by which they could ever be put in place. So I think within the notion of the mines aspect of what are we giving advice to defense, it becomes a very difficult, it's a very much a subset of the problem. Where no one's talking about the Canadian Armed Forces should own emergency management across the entire country. No one's talking about this notion that even there could be a federal response to this, that would be somehow sweeping. And therefore, in a very practical way, and I guess this is where we need to figure out what exactly we think the mandate is to give to the mines audience, the question becomes a lot smaller in that sense. There is no mitigation aspect from a Canadian Armed Forces perspective, for example. So if defense just wants to know that answer, it's pretty simple. Or do you want to take it more maximally and say, look, this is the problem we're talking about, and there are many dimensions, some of which are not actually of interest to national defense. So I think that's a pretty big decision to be made in terms of the project, from my perspective.
Sorry. I just want to make one comment on Chris's thoughts, which is, while we are funded, this project is funded by Mines, which is a D&D enterprise. We are a collaborative network aiming to provide, hopefully, knowledge to the public sector. And at the end of 3 years, our goal is to help improve things for Canada and not just feed the beast of D&D for what their knowledge is. Now, we will want to have outputs that D&D go, okay, you're doing stuff, but we don't need to restrict this team's research and outputs to only think about what are the equities of the CAF and what are the implications for the CAF. We can think broader than that. Because at the end of the day, if we go in 3 years and ask for Mines for another set of funds, they're mostly evaluate us on the next idea, not on the execution of this project, because it's not really a renewal process. And the network, the Mines thing itself is supposed to be aiming at mobilizing sites on defense and security. It's not necessarily just telling the CAF what to do. So whether we stick with response or move on to mitigation or resilience or other things is up to these two people. At Causer, it has, our remit is broad. We have a hard problem that we have for students whenever we tell students, oh, you can research whatever you want. They're like, oh no, I gotta figure out what I want to do. That's a hard problem for them. This is my hard problem giving to Nero and MDAD and Causer. The research agenda is up to them. So they don't need to think about what plays to the building.
I just want to add with Chris's comment that Canadian Armed Forces also is going to face climate vulnerability themselves. Jurisdictionally, they have a huge volume of land resources and also other infrastructure. So in terms of mitigation, they have some homework to do as well. Coming back to Sakib's questions about one home, like President George Bush did, Homeland Security, bringing in terrorism and other security issues, natural hazards and others under one umbrella. So what are the implications of having one house, looking after all kinds of emergencies and disasters? There are positive things, also there are negative things. The positive things is that you have one window, one administration, you can see the big picture, make the big decisions, so it's very efficient. The problem is basically the hazard type, because in real world, let me bring 2 or 3 examples. Infectious disease, health issues, like COVID-19 or other infectious disease, SARS and so and so. And then you think about cyber security and cyber insecurity, and then you bring this natural hazards of different type, floods, earthquake, forests. The spectrum is so wide that not one force can deal with it. Every single of these 3 examples requires very specialized knowledge. To go much deeper, humans had no knowledge about how the COVID-19 virus behaves. No one had any clue. And everybody throughout the world struggled for months after months. So that kind of uncertainty we are dealing with. So we need very specialized type of knowledge and research. So how can we think of that one house or such a narrow silo can deal with it? We cannot. So we have to have a specialized. So we need to think about that how we can have an integrated approach without losing the sight of that specialized needs. And that's why we need conversation, understanding that what kind of dynamic institutional mechanism, flexibility to deal with uncertainty that we need. And that's why we need dynamic thinking, that we cannot think like historical past trends don't fit in many cases in extremes. So how can we project future? We can't. But there are methods that in human society, Rand Corporation invented Delphi method using human intuition, bringing the expert that what's going to be the next 30 years, 50 years. Like technology we cannot predict. We can create some scenarios, but we cannot predict how it's going to change. Based on those scenarios, we can prepare ourselves. We can prepare our forces, our institutions better and better. But we cannot find a magic bullet solution. So that's the way we need to frame our institutions and prepare to deal with certain things that we know and certain things that we do not know.
Well, that's really a big thing to wrap our hands around with. And I think for this conversation, I'm looking backwards at the past day and a half. I guess what I'd like to do is ask a question and see if we get responses to it. And particularly I want to ask the students these questions because this stuff, you folks are right in the middle of trying to put together all the things that you're studying and make sense of it from all your classwork. But your minds are, you're not locked into things like us old folks are. So I want to ask all of the students in the room 2 questions, and you can answer either one, which is at the end of these 6 presentations or so, what is the one thing that made you go, huh? What is the one thing you know now that you didn't know before that you want to pursue and understand better? The different thing is what is the one question you're now really interested in? What is the one thing about all the stuff that you want to know more about? And I'd like the students to think about that and talk about this because we folks have been dominating the microphone. And you've been watching us and listening to us. And so you've been thinking about this more deeply than we have because we're just thinking about the thing we're about to say next. So,
Steve, we'll start from here. Okay. Sort of mandatory response.
Okay. Thank you for to open the floor. So my question is why, what if we should look upon some multi-purpose approach, or suppose each and every organization has a particular role, but what if we make this organization much more multi-purpose, kind of like in art or in engineering they call it kind of like changing stuffs, like changing one module can actually change the whole purpose. So there are so many multi-purpose cases you will see around the world. There are practices. So military is a particular organization which can serve as a multi-purpose organization. So if all the organizations are kind of go with this multi-purpose approach, shouldn't it be more effective in terms of like the fire service? They are also working as a responder. The police, they are also working as a responder. But if other organizations actually come together as a multi-purpose organizations, then wouldn't it actually reduce the pressure upon the military, as military is the last resort, and what we saw on the video that yes, military should be on the last line. It is the last resort. Shouldn't we be much more multi-purpose? Shouldn't be the other organization be multi-purpose? It would actually increase efficacy.
For you.
Okay, I want to like intervene, like I want to differ with Sakib here that yeah, we can make all the organization multi-purpose, but the problem is we need specialized knowledge as well. Like we need if we saving people from fire, so we have to have that skilled person who can save people from fire. If we make all the organization multi-purpose, so here is a problem that we don't have specialized people to help others.
Hi everyone, I've been attending the last 2 days of this event, and I must say we have learned a lot, although we have been occupied with other stuff as well. But I want to thank you all first of all, and then I would like to give my perception on Sakib's question and then go to your one. My perception on making the organizations multi-purpose is more inclined to be negative, because being from a developing country, I know we already have a lot of confusions on overlapping responsibilities of organizations. We still do not know how to directly fund what for a specific organization. We have a dearth of clear definitions, about roles and responsibilities of organizations, and making them multi-purpose will give us a lot of loopholes to get away with. And we don't want that, of course, especially in a sensitive issue like disaster management. My question was aligning with two things. One is military, one is disaster management, and one was the gender and social aspect of the disaster management, which I felt needs a more discussion based on the last 2 days of the event. So I know that we all agree the military has to be involved in the disaster assistance, in especially the relief and recovery activities, and military has been doing an amazing job, especially in Bangladesh. Public rely on military in a lot of ways. They feel comfortable. But I also like to mention that who are we relying? How much? For example, the shelter center projects in Bangladesh have been failed previously because of gender and women aspect. Women were not feeling comfortable to go to the shelter centers, sharing the same washroom as men. And that created a problem. We created a warning system, we created shelter centers, but women didn't go there. There was a problem with the livestock also. They felt an economic and an emotional attachment with their livestock. They didn't want to leave them, and there was no proper management for that. So I want to ask that: do we feel that we need to compartmentalize? We need to create segments within the military that they can deal with the gender issues, because we have female officers, female soldiers as well. Can we do that? Or we want to rely on the federal provincial, municipal, civil agencies to deal with the social and gender aspects, because that will reduce the dependency on military. So this was my specific question. How can we compartmentalize general and social aspects of disaster management? Another one is a bit broader question from my side. Do you think we need a global training on military that can combine the developing and developed countries when it comes to disaster assistance? Because I know the systems work more or less same in the military when it comes to on-field functioning. So do you think there should be a global training on disaster management on them? And how do you see it coming? So one is the social and gender aspect, another is the global training one. I do not research on disaster specifically. I research on small-scale fisheries. So I am on the resource management side, but we have done courses. So this was my question. And I felt this too needs more discussion based on last 2 days.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve,
Well, let's keep on collecting the questions.
microphone to them.
So I have an answer to Steve's question, but then a commentary to the should I say concern about multipurpose organizations. I'd say multipurpose organizations are not sustainable in relation to the rapid rising threats for a number of reasons. So, in as much as nature is one of the challenges, and the CAF is deployed as a last resort, there are other challenges that the CAF needs to be prepared for. Contributions to alliances like NATO, the UN, and other things, but also protecting Canada's national interests at home and abroad, because nature is important, yes, but like as different presenters have stressed, there are other organizations and the private sector who can relieve some of those challenges, and the emphasis should not be necessarily on the military or CAF itself, but maybe the creation of these multipurpose organizations should not be reliant on the armed forces. It could be a combination of like NGOs, CBOs, and other private sector industries. That will make it multifaceted in that way, but then also relieve the CAF of the duty to be the last resort, but then prepare the CAF to work and protect Canada's national interests. And then in addition to putting the CAF as like the last resort, there are challenges of the time to create these multi-purpose organizations and deploy them, to create, to train, and then deploy them. As Major Nick gave in his presentation yesterday, like before the CAF members are deployed, there's 3 to 6 days of training for different things. So then it doesn't work out efficiently in the sense that the threat is tomorrow and they have to be deployed tomorrow, but they missed that training. So it won't be in the best interest of the CAF, as we talked about, that they need to be deployed for things like this. And then considering resources available, like we've also talked about like the finances about it, looking at the legal structure and the distribution of power according to the Canadian Constitution, the province, like Professor Chris said, like benefits more in the economics of things, not having to bear that cost, but then the CAF like takes negative costs when they're losing time, losing resources that they can use to protect national interests and prepare for the unstable situation in the international society. And then, so that's my comment on the multipurpose organizations and how they can be. And then to answer Steve's question about one thing I know now that I didn't know before, I'd say it's more about the concept of sustainability. Looking at the presentation given yesterday by Mr. Gilbert about like indigenous knowledge and relationship to the land and how indigenous knowledge has helped nature responses, like responses to nature situations. And then looking at like the question of the CAF deployment, like for nature responses and abroad, as well as climate change, the presentation on climate change, the key thing that stood out to me was sustainability. At the end of the day, if the CAF is deployed, is that sustainable in the long term? Looking at the opportunity cost. And then looking at the climate change impact and low carbon outputs that hopefully we can get to, and like rising global temperatures. And then using like indigenous knowledge that has existed for a number of centuries. The key point is sustainability. How can we make all these things come together to ensure that there's sustainability? Because the graphs we looked at yesterday from the climate presentation looked up to 2100. It looks far away now, but during the presentation, what of our grandchildren? What does that look like for them? So I guess one thing I didn't know before now is like sustainability. How can we implement everything we've talked about for the past 2 days to be more sustainable for the benefit of Canada?
Thank you. Before Steve, may I please interject? So we have Dennis Taberner with us. So let me bring the general because I lost him twice. Sorry, General, you must be waiting for long. So the audience, let me have the privilege to introduce Major General Taberner, who was enlisted in the Royal Winnipeg Rifles in 1967, serving as a rifleman, corporal, senior corporal, second lieutenant, lieutenant, transferring to the regular force in May 7, 1972. On completion of infantry officer training, he was posted to 3rd Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment as a platoon commander, and subsequently regimental employment, including platoon commanders, and he has commanded a host of battalions in his tour of duty. And he returned to Winnipeg in June 1993. He transferred to the reserves, employed as senior staff officer administration. And I had the fortune of meeting General Dennis Taberner because we were both in the Senate Committee of Royal Winnipeg Rifles. So, General, the discussions we are having now, you must have overheard something, a part of it, I believe, that what is the best mode of employment of Canadian Armed Forces in disaster management in collaboration with other agencies. And just to give you a brief context here, we played the clip that National Security Advisor Mr. Fadden had with the national media because he was raising concern that we are using CAF too frequently, and that is distracting CAF's basic and core capabilities of defending the nation. So please join in the discussions. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Kauser, and I apologize for the technical difficulties and whatnot, and that I was unavailable to join you before now. One of your speakers, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, talked about the Canadian Armed Forces being a force of last resort. And I think years ago that was the case, but now it seems more prevalent that the provinces reach out to the Canadian Armed Forces to deal with issues that they are having troubles sorting out themselves. And the military being called in to assist during COVID is an example of it, of the military stepping up to assist the provinces at the province's request. But again, I think that the armed forces should be truly a force of last resort. And some of your speakers have mentioned about using the resources that you can find within the community. And sometimes those resources are finite and the military may have to come in. But if you have the resources within your community to deal with something, then you should use those resources first before you call in the military. I was intimately involved in the flood of '97 in Manitoba, and I actually worked with the government COVID response team for about 6.5 months at the end of 20 and early 2021, and saw a number of things. And I guess the biggest point that I might have for you is decision making. I found that in both those instances, some of the biggest issues that we had were the negative impact of senior decision makers on the response. And because they did not necessarily understand what was happening, or only parachuted in periodically, so they did not have a good idea of what was going on. So Jody talked about training emergency management professionals. I think one of the other critical aspects of this is at all levels of government, whether it's municipal or federal or provincial, is that those leaders and decision makers who are involved in dealing with an emergency need to be educated as well. And if they are not educated, then they may take you down rabbit holes that you don't want to be going down. And I saw this in the Manitoba flood. I also saw that in the Manitoba COVID response. So from a military point of view, the leaders, the civilian leaders, need to be educated, one, on what they have within their own jurisdictions to deal with the response, the emergency, and two, what the Canadian Armed Forces will bring to it. And I guess the important thing that everybody needs to remember is once you ask for the Canadian Armed Forces, they will decide what they are going to bring to the dance. And you as politicians or decision makers might not like what the military shows up with, but when you ask for them, they will bring to the dance what they think is necessary to deal with the issue. I'll leave it at that, Kauser. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, General.
Thank you.
Thank you, General. Thank you so much for your wonderful comments. So back to Steve, we were talking about, General, feel free to stay with us, and we promise we are a wonderful crowd, no criticisms per se. So Steve, back to you and the ongoing discussions with the students, and what are the main takeaways from 1.5 days of discussion. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for bringing nice question at the table. Just I would like to draw your attention that we are talking about multiple purpose approach, or as approach. But my question is, what are the goals of this approach? We would like to reduce or minimize the cost, minimize the losses and damages. So my question is that who are the first responders to the necessary triggered event? So in this case, I think that community members, vulnerable groups are the first responder who can respond quickly to minimize loss. In this case, I think that though we talk about different approaches and things, but community have their own knowledge, own skills, and own innovation. I believe that at first we need to nurture those skills and beliefs and their values to reduce their cost, following bottom-up approach. Then we can apply a multi-purpose or wall-hazard approach following top-down to respond effectively to loss and to reduce loss and damage. So I think that at first we need to integration between top-down and bottom-up approach, so that we have to have high skilled knowledge and values about the community members. After integration, we can apply or we can respond quickly to the groups, to the vulnerable communities who have been affected by this triggered event. So my opinion is that at first go for strengthening local institutions, because local institutions can work effectively, quickly to reduce losses and damages. So my question to all of you, how can we integrate skill, knowledge, and values into top-down approach, so that top-down approach can effectively work for minimizing losses and damages? Then another important thing I would like to draw your attention, all of you, we are talking about financial cost. Obviously, disaster management or emergency management is a business for everyone. It's not a charity. All of you think that it's a charity of government organization. Government organization will perform all activities. If you think about earthquake, it is not interacting, it is not striking only one community. It is interacting private organization, government organization, all institutions. So we have to engage private institutions to respond to disaster. So how can we build a cooperation, collaboration with private institutions so that private institutions can respond effectively, and they should be accountable to disaster. Often they are culprits for climate change. We need to draw their attention. We have to have a strong plan for responding to disaster. So I think that we obviously we need all hazard approach, but each approach should have different context in the context of a specific disaster. So these are my comments and suggestions to all of you.
Keep it brief.
Thank you for coming from Ottawa and bringing some of the issues about the accommodation of First Nations communities in disaster emergency management. What I'm hearing from the students and also from my own understanding is that many of the risks of our resources and our habitat is related to how do we manage resources, particularly natural resources, our land, forestry, water body, rivers, coasts, and so on and so forth. In recent years, there have been immense interest and recognition of the sustainability connection with the indigenous and traditional knowledge. And if you look into the literature and also the practice of how much Canadian society and practitioners are accommodating, thinking and accommodating this indigenous knowledge, also globally, how much recognition is there. There are huge walls there. Although in academia, we are talking about this integration of knowledge and so on. And there have been efforts to make sit on the table, as Gilbert was mentioning again and again. The major problem is that even the First Nation people, scholars and others sitting in the same round table, but in terms of equal recognition and equal quote unquote power, in terms of exerting it and so on, that has not happened yet. So coming back to your question, that how can we really think about sustainability of the society, bringing in risk as a component in that sustainability and learning from the indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, along with modern knowledge, because your question was integration of scientific knowledge, modern knowledge, along with the indigenous and traditional knowledge. It's a newer area, newer thinking, but in order to make an actual integration, because there are epistemological contradictions, science do things differently than the First Nation do. So there are inbuilt contradictions, but that can be overcome with negotiation, dialogue, understanding, give and take. That's a process-oriented thing. But in order to make that process happening, we have to change our mindset. That's why I'm getting at basically our mindset that we are in practice and academia in other areas. Our mindset that is an equal footing and equal space for other knowledge holders. So that's called pluralistic approach, rather than thinking that this scientific or another particular framework or pattern the right thing to do. I think we have to move away from it, recognizing that there are multiple ways of doing things and finding solutions from multiple perspectives. We need to create that kind of platform. We need to work in that direction. Thank you.
Can I just jump in here just to share a bunch of thoughts? My favorite is prevention and mitigation. So I'll go back to the drawing board per se to say that I'll use a couple of examples. What happened in long-term care, because the general said he was involved in the response to COVID. And in Ontario especially, the long-term care homes, they were really impacted because this older population, they're concentrated in those buildings. And there's like, nobody knew what to do, and army had to be requested for help, so they did. But then what happened afterwards? Research shows, CBC Marketplace has done this study in Denmark. They have home care, which is 1/3 of the price of long-term care, which is institutionalized buildings, and you put your elderly in those buildings, and then they have to do whatever. So research shows that this is 1/3 of the price of that. And you ask people, they all want home care, and yet the government of the day goes ahead, announces thousands of new beds. Oh, we are doing something for you because you want it, more of the same. So everything is ignored. What people want is ignored. What research shows is ignored. The second example I'll give is High River in Calgary. Why it's called High River is because it was high. The levels, it was high all the time. That's why it's called High River. So you don't settle by that river, and then hundreds of years will pass. In geological time scale, hundreds of years is nothing. It's like a blink of an eye. And we need to be mindful of the past events, the history, the perspectives, and go back to mitigation and prevention. The third example is early warning systems. Environment Canada will tell you how many times they have missed the warning. Just recent one was Vancouver, snowfall. The snowstorm came and they said, we didn't see that coming. Atmospheric river, they saw it coming a week in advance. These are extreme weather events, in advance they are coming. But so two issues there. They missed the warning, they didn't see, but they saw it coming, but they didn't anticipate the severity of it. So those two things. The third point here is the third dimension to it, is that people, whether they will heed the warning or not, that depends on their perception. That depends on their past experiences, whether the warnings were accurate, whether they went through some difficulties because they were evacuated, nothing happened. So it could be a variety of reasons. So those are the things that we are also working on, early warning systems. Also, we're working on communication methods, how the messages are designed right from the beginning, how people comprehend the message that's given out to them. So, and then the last example I'll use is the room for the river model that they practice in the Netherlands. And they went, so the river would be flooding, year after year after year, and they decided, no, we need to let the river be the river, and we need to clear all the surroundings, the farms and the people who were living there, and they had to do a good work in convincing everybody, bring everybody to the table, and eventually farmers agreed to move away from the river, and now they're doing much better. So room for the river, I am relating that to comparing with the Don River in Toronto. Don River was straightened 100 years ago, and meanders were removed, and now they're trying to fix that a little bit. Whatever you can do is by naturalizing the mouth of the Don, which goes into Lake Ontario. So with those, like I said, my favorite is prevention and mitigation. And we talk about things, which is fine, but take the reflections and the lessons back to planning and preparedness stage. So.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alejandra. I'm a master's student at the NRI, Natural Resource Institute, first year. And thank you very much for the event and all the interesting contributions and topics you brought to the table. I have a couple of comments. I've been wondering a lot about what Dr. Endak said about building scenarios. I'm wondering how those scenarios are being built, because I think the conversation is really interesting, but I think it's still being framed in an understanding that the world is going to keep functioning the way it has been functioning up till now. And I think that the uncertainties we need to consider that might not be the case due to all the rapid changes and all the the things that are going with the environment, with the economy, with the social movements. So I'm wondering if that is being considered when scenarios are being built to be presented into, I don't know, like the authorities to build plans around them, to think about perhaps the most unlikely things, because that's kind of what we're looking at, right? Someone mentioned it yesterday in a presentation, it's like high risk and unlikely events. Exactly.
Probability.
Yeah, low probability, but like high risk, right? So that seems to be becoming the new normal in a sense, right? So I'm wondering about that, like how are those scenarios? How are we thinking about that? Because we've also heard a lot about systemic changes and shifts in mindsets and all this. So how are we actually doing that? That would be my question. What is it truly, how is that really truly being addressed? Because in a sense, it seems to me from my very limited knowledge and perspective that we're expecting institutions to keep functioning the way they are, to keep following the mandates they've historically had. And I don't, to me, there's like some missing piece into what we're trying to talk about in the abstract and what we're looking at in the practical. And I'm wondering how we're building that bridge. He also mentioned that there's no top-down strategy to like mobilize. But I'm wondering if we have identified bottom-up stakeholders that could be mobilized in order to respond or to prepare, or that are, preparing, planning, mitigating in a sense in their local communities. Because I think in a sense, it seems to me that we're having a conversation that goes from how to use a centralized power into a decentralized needs. So I'm just wondering about that connection. So yeah, that's, I think this one is. Thank you.
Thank you, can you hear me? Well, first I just want to introduce myself. I'm an informal student and really part of NRI or any other institute. I have a PhD in astrophysics, and I moved here recently. I'm starting to work as a data scientist in the government of Manitoba. And from there, my first comment is I have a personal interest on helping this moving forward from that perspective, on how the government can actually use its new capabilities of data science and bringing that analysis to the table. So I just want to leave that there. And hopefully that offline we have conversations about that. And my comment from here is actually resonates a lot with what you said, and it's something that sometimes I hear in the literature about the lack of imagination of all the risk and the problem of the lack of imagination. And the way I see all the conversation is going is a bit of like we're preparing for the emergencies of the present, but failing to bring the topics or the issues of the future. And some topics that I just come to my mind are, for instance, how mass migrations look into all of this. At some point, that will arrive to Canada, or if might happen. Thinking about the unlikely scenarios like the collapse of the food production system, how the response to that would look like. So really thinking of the worst case scenarios and how can those be tackled. And we can think about, well, they might look very far in the future, but there is science is telling us that there is a 50% chance that within the next decade we will arrive to the 1.0
probably 1.5C, and that will have issues that science don't really understand yet. It is not that far in the future. A 50% chance, that's throwing a coin in the air, right? And so it's really high probability. And so, and just coming back to what I was saying, thinking about the reduction of the response capability from the problems themselves, from the climate crisis, and for instance, just talking about like the food production, the same we can talk about the reduction of the economic power for the same reason, right? So as we move forward and we have could happen that we have less capacity to produce whatever, and then in that same sense, the government or whatever organization will have less capacity to finance or whatever. At the same time, issues are becoming larger. So you have to put more money to things that, the longer we take in preventing something, the more expensive it becomes. You're gonna wrap it there.
Use that.
Thank you. Sorry, one thing is that my question was actually a bit kind of like two-way. I hadn't mentioned specifically, so I'm going to become more specific. So multi-purpose organization means that I'm from a military administrative institute. So I was involved in TREE, which is a military exercise, civil military exercise. So I had that opportunity to participate. So in the first year, they had these different cells. So they actually create a simulation of an earthquake exercise. From that aspect, I'm actually talking about. So in that particular exercise, what they do is they show how military is going to respond and how civilian organizations are going to respond. So multi-purpose organization means that we have this city corporation, or what we call municipality in Canada. So their responsibility during an earthquake would be removing the debris, or rescuing people. So with that organization or the municipality, there are other organizations like construction firms and others. Those, in normal time, they work for constructions. But during any hazard or during any disaster, they would go for this response. So that was in the exercise. So in the previous exercise, what was that all the stakeholders had a different role and everyone was involved. Okay, everyone was going through only one thing. So in that exercise, some of the people suggested that, okay, there should be Ministry of Women in this particular area. So everyone was there, every stakeholder was there. So the organizations had this particular aspect. In the next year, what they did is that ministry, that women ministry and women rights groups, those were on the table, and that organizations had that, okay, we should be planning on this, that, and that. So the identification was quite easier in that aspect. So multi-purpose organization doesn't mean that particular organization will respond in fire or something. They would look onto their perspective, and from that aspect, they would suggest and they would say that, okay, what we can do is this, what we can do is that. Or that organization can be used as a backup that, okay, in this disaster, we can do that. As an example, if there is a nuclear explosion, people will die. That particular dead bodies are being handled by the health department. But if the funeral homes are trained or they have a code of conduct that, okay, in case of nuclear accidents, they have this, they have to do this. If they have the resources, we will hand over these dead bodies, because in disaster, dead body management is also an aspect. So it is one example that different organizations can be multi-purpose in terms of responding to disaster, or in terms of creating mitigation, or in terms of recovery. Thank you.
It's getting very interesting. Listen to students' comments are very fascinating all the time. So thank you so much for that. And in my learning the past 2 days, or previously in preparation for my presentation, it's been immense learning opportunity for me. And first thing, just wanted to really quickly mention the role of military, Canadian Armed Force. What I learned, not only the really high top level well-trained people to defend the country is such a important role, as well as the responsibilities and the commitment the Canadian Armed Force individuals and other institutions making is I think it's the very notable, important thing that we have in Canada. And at the individual level, these individual people are, my understanding is that they want to be the one that they can risk themselves to save the country. So that's a very important thing that we recognize is really the fundamental level that why they are part of this institution is so then they can help save lives and help people. And I think that's maybe we need to learn from them, and probably I think talking about the cost, it's very important. Economy is so important, and then we've been so occupied with the economy and cost and expenses, and I'm a little bit concerned about it, especially these days. So the discussion of the efficient use, sorry to say that kind of a language of military is often associated with a cost, and the kind of a not real dismissing the fact that who they are, what they do to the country, to the communities. So what I wanted to say is the earlier on yesterday's Gilbert discussion, everybody should be on the table and then bring in all the ideas and dialogue, talking through, and avoid repetitive kind of result that you were talking about. So and somebody said that the lack of imagination. So I think, First Nations Indigenous knowledge, that's another thing that we definitely would need to learn and benefit from, because that's my understanding essence of human relationship and how we relate to each other. We learned during this COVID time how important for us to have face-to-face communication, and we miss so much of the kind of connection. So there are lots of new ideas. Should something we can't dismiss. We try to really pay attention to what's happening. And one of your questions, like what's going on, and because if we don't really know what they are, or if we don't have a name for it, sometimes we miss it, right? I do a little bookkeeping. I took a bookkeeping course a while ago and then learned about how the accounting works. It's a very effective, very, it's one of the kind of a history, like traditional knowledge about how you can do accounting. But at the same time, if there's no line for it, then we don't know that where money is coming from or going, right? So it's the cost benefit analysis we use when we do risk assessment, but then it's not just only the economic cost, but then like opportunity cost, and so social or maybe emotional cost benefit analysis type of thing would be with our good creative imagination to use, not just simply the economic cost. So then that would really have a good assessment of what we are benefiting from doing this. Requesting military is really benefiting the community, then that's probably important. But then what we mean by benefit is not just cost or property damage, but the understanding, acknowledgement of the people helping others. That's the kind of value I think we really put some kind of value on, and that's where we would like to move toward, I think. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Let me just take a few minutes to answer some of the issues that came about, and then I will wrap up with my final thoughts, and then I will request Steve to wrap up the session. With regard to scenario building cannot be done exhaustively. It's based on some assumptions, and assumptions are made with regard to worst case scenarios, business as usual, and best scenarios. And you can have different subsets. So scenarios are based on basically different imaginations and assumptions. So are scientists thinking of accounting for uncertainty? The answer is yes and no, because it is almost impossible to predict what is uncertain, but humans, we use our knowledge and our intuition. So in terms of this uncertainty, dealing with uncertainty, the way we deal with it is having flexibility in our institutions and our responses. Second thing is by enhancing self-reorganizing capacity. And third is that you mobilize all your resources, to deal with, those type of uncertain scenarios. So, so it's almost an impossible task, but still we try to do it. I just want to cite two examples. Yesterday I was mentioning to Dr. Danny Blair that when we looked at general circulation model, and they predicted that 30 years down the road, the carbon concentration will be 415. And after 30 years, I went back to the book and I was teaching in my class. I found it was exactly missing just only 1 point. So we could be that precise, but also IPCC failed in a big way about the glacier, melting on the Himalayas. They predicted a lot more deglaciation, and that didn't happen because nature has its own force to, balance the disequilibrium as much as nature can do. So that part, we have limitations. Human knowledge and technology has limitations to account for nature's capacity. The reason is very simple. There are billions of variables, trillions of variables work in reality. And our capacity to account for those things, very, very limited. We can account for only certain limited number of variables. So those are our unknown part, and we cannot control and we cannot predict. Coming back to your one interesting issue about mass migration, I'm sure Steve will agree, and many scholars, Chris, all will agree that Canada today is not an isolated island. It cannot function. Canada does not have, like USA has Mexican border, whole Latin America is open to US border. Canada doesn't have that kind of problem. Russians are not going to cross the Arctic and come over here or others. But Canada is not, isolated, because if there is tremendous catastrophic, event in Africa or Asia, there will be spillover effect on Canada's economy, society, demography, in every single aspect. What happens in Middle East, what happens in South Asia, what happens in South Africa or West Africa affects Canadian all aspects. It's because we are in an integrated world in all terms, economically, otherwise. Even one virus, if it comes out in Timbuktu and so, within 24 hours it reaches to Canada. So we must think of Canada integrated way. So your question about mass migration, absolutely. Some models in Canada are accounting for this, and those thoughts are taken into account in the decision making. My final thoughts about General's comment about decision making. that when military is given an assignment, they will do their job in their own way because they have got a mission. Now, emergency management, yesterday it came about again and again. Emergency management, we are talking also about human management and societal management. Emergency management is not managing a particular physical, biological environment. It's managing humans brings a lot of complex issues. Emotional issues, sentimental issues, psychological issues, economic issues, social issues. When you deal with it, you cannot go with mechanical programmatic decision making. So the matrix becomes really, really bigger and complex. And that's why you need to have multi-stakeholders mobilization and that kind of decision making capacity. It cannot be linear. It cannot be also left to open-ended things. So we need to optimize the decision making in a most efficient way by bringing these aspects into a synthesis. And we need that kind of exercise, that kind of modeling, that kind of imagination. So finally, my thoughts is that in this forum last 2 days, you talk about multi-stakeholders mobilization to deal with emerging emergencies, including Canadian Armed Forces. In reflection, that in Canada, we are far away from being perfect to respond to emergencies. We have gained a lot of grounds in the 1920s and 30s, the maritime provinces, fishers. Almost every year, 30 to 200 sailors died. Nowadays, because of the rescue missions and Canadian Navy and other, hardly there are 1 or 2 people die. Statistically speaking, you can imagine technology and institutional arrangement made that difference. In the same way, we can gain ground in other aspects, but we cannot be overconfident. In order to do that, in the present complex context, this multi-stakeholders understanding, dialogue, and then coming up with solution, because we cannot talk about only problems. We need to think about what's the workable solutions, and the solution cannot be static, cannot be given. What it works today, tomorrow it may not work. So that's why younger generation should come up and with that imagination that how we can really adapt to this kind of dynamic environment. Emergency management should be a subset of the larger picture, as Chris mentioned that, disaster and development context, because that disaster, development, emergency, that nexus should be the issue of our dialogue, and SCAP and other institutions' role then should be determined in a dynamic way. Thank you very much for taking all the efforts and making all the efforts for coming here, and I hope that you can go home nicely and enjoy the day. So it's over to Steve, please.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank all the students. Steve energized all of you, and you came up with some wonderful ideas. You wouldn't have, the room was quiet, and all of a sudden it was nice to see that.
Well, we keep student silence for a day and a half, and inevitably once we release the top of the pod coils over with really good ideas and thoughts. What did I learn over the past day and a half? I find myself as an interloper because I've never studied domestic emergency operations. And I've also, in the course of the past couple of years, discovered that very few people of my kind have, which is that it's not something that political scientists or public administration types have really spent a lot of time thinking about. Those folks who study Canadian defense don't study this stuff, despite the fact that it has always been one of 4 priorities in every defense review is aid to civil power. It's also always the last of 4, and it's always treated as the last of 4. Despite the fact that the pandemic, for instance, has killed more Canadians than all the foreign wars combined. And so that suggests maybe a change in priorities, but that's a hard thing to push. So what did I learn over the past couple of days? One of the striking things is that, given a lot of the information we got yesterday, the notion of emergency suggests something that is a rare thing. But emergencies now in Canada are like streetcars. There's always another one coming, and they're coming along faster and faster, so they're actually more efficient streetcars than what we're used to on Ottawa. So people still treat them as being exceptional events. For any individual, they're exceptional, but for a country, they're collectively common. And so that we need to think about not necessarily securitizing it, but normalizing it, that bad things are normal. But there's what MDAD said today, and he said yesterday, and other folks have spoken on this, is that weather is normal. Whether it destroys us, whether it has a huge impact, is up to us. That it's socially constructed, it's politically constructed. And so the question is, how do we build, design, adapt organizations and cities and infrastructure and all the rest, so that way when things happen, the water goes to a place where it does least harm. When there's a fire, it does not spread or there's minimal damage. That we invest more, for instance, in the resources in the northern communities, in the First Nations, so that way they don't have to be evacuated. I didn't realize how much evacuation happened. Gilbert's discussion was really very useful yesterday, and how traumatic it is. And the question is, if we have to evacuate people, do we always have to evacuate them to a place that is as foreign as Winnipeg? Perhaps we can evacuate them to some other Indigenous community where we've put resources in place, so that way when the inevitable happens, the adjustment is not so sharp. So there's lots of things like that to think about in terms of how do we do things differently, so that way the shock of weather is minimized, because we're going to get a whole lot more weather. And that's not even think about earthquakes and other natural phenomena, but climate change is going to definitely shape the weather in very problematic ways. It's the question, how do we get ahead of that? And the big challenge for this is political scientists have long taught that politicians and voters care about today, not tomorrow. That in the 1990s, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict issued numerous reports, and I forget how many volumes, just trying to persuade people that preventing ethnic conflict is much better than responding to one and intervening one. And that's, well, duh, it's pretty basic stuff, but actually getting politicians and voters and media to think about doing things before they happen is really challenging. And so one of the things that I realized in the course of yesterday's conversation this morning's is the best time to actually build better is during an emergency and in the aftermath of an emergency. It's not before. We're never gonna, well, not never, but it's gonna be very, very hard to develop enough political energy to get politicians willing to vote for money to spend on something that won't benefit them today or the voters today, but that benefit on people they can't imagine 10, 20, 30 years down the road. That's really, really hard. But crises create coalitions or break coalitions and offer the opportunities to create new ones. And so that's something to think about, is how to develop a search capacity of experts, not only to intervene and say, hey, this is how we should be managing this emergency, but using that moment in time to say, okay, what our next step should be is this, so that way this thing doesn't happen again. So if it floods in Manitoba, okay, in the middle of the flood, okay, let's not rebuild this town right on the water. Let's move it further backwards. You can do that at that moment when people are going to be pouring money, resources, and energy, but we need to have the experts be ready to show up and say that then when they will be listened to, because they're not going to be listened to now, but they'll be listened to at the moment. So that's something to think about. One of the recurring themes of all this stuff, whether it's this emergency, which is these emergencies are caused by nature, or the convoy that was caused by people, federalism in Canada is really thoroughly broken. And I don't think the Constitution imagined provinces led by people who have truly bad faith. And I don't know how to overcome that, because as Chris discussed yesterday, there are already incentives in place for provinces to impose costs on the federal government. But when they really don't care about governance and the public good in the long term, then it's really, really hard for the federal folks to do anything. And it's really hard for the local folks to do anything because they're trapped by premiers who don't want to do anything. I don't know how to deal with that, but this is something that we can learn from, that there are certain things that work well in emergency management that haven't worked well elsewhere. Like there seems to be a whole lot more successful whole of government efforts in an emergency, thanks to people like Nate and people like Joanna Bota. There does seem to be a good collaboration in the moment, and that's something that the military complaint didn't happen in Afghanistan, places like that people talk about whole of government, but doesn't happen. So maybe we can learn for our purposes from emergency management for other areas, since it does seem to work in some places, even as the federalism still gets to be the way. One thing I learned over the course of the past day and a half is that there are lots of organizations out there of people who are collaborating. So Nate talked about his meeting he had with his liaisons. Talked about his meeting with the other emergency managers. There are these associations in Canada of people who do meet and convey lessons. I guess the question I have is how many times do those meetings actually break the silos and have different people in different communities talk to each other? Gilbert's discussion suggests that there are certain communities that are constantly left out. I don't know how to include them, but it does suggest that these are conversations that need to cross connections and into different silos. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of this organization that I helped create, because the CDSN this weekend worked by bringing people together from across different areas to talk to each other and learn from each other. And so just Kaiser and MDAD and Nero, just keep doing this. This is super valuable to have these conversations, because I don't think a lot of these people talk to each other when they're not shouting at each other saying, no, give me this, I need this at this moment because there's an emergency right now. So actually having people talk in the equivalent of peacetime is super helpful when you're actually in an emergency. So I think that this is really great, what you guys have done today. So how to conclude all this stuff? Well, I have a favorite ask of the organizers and a favorite ask of the students and other participants, which is one thing that we promised at D&D in our Minds application is policy briefs. And so anybody and everybody in this room and online, if they're still online, if you want to, it's not a requirement, but if you want to, we'd love to receive a 1 to 2 page document. That's all it is. It doesn't require endless amounts of research. It's just taking the research the knowledge you already have. And a policy brief in this framework, and I can send you the templates if you're interested, is basically, what is the problem that you are addressing? It could be a very finite problem. It doesn't have to be, I want to have world peace. It could be something very specific. You identified a particular policy problem. What is it that you propose to fix it? And what does that require? Based on your knowledge. That's it. And we don't need to have every single person write one of these, but we need to have more than one person write one of these. And so it's up to you. I'm not going to assign responsibilities to anybody, but if you have something that has been gnawing away at you and say, I've identified this challenge, here's what I think of as being the right way to proceed. Write it up, and then we'll put it on our website, and we'll send it off to D&D as proof that our research is producing knowledge that we want to disseminate to everybody and everybody. And if you've written, folks who have been online, if they're still online, if you've written papers on this stuff, you want to distill your paper from the 30 or 40 pages down to a page and a half, that would be super handy. I think, for instance, Jody's presentation, the problem is we don't have a profession of emergency management. Here's why it's important. And here's 1 or 2 ways to try to get there. And one thing I would say to Jody, if she was still online, is there's a whole discussion of what professionalism means in the military. And we civil military relations people have real problems with the way that's been conceived, but there's still a very important notion of having a profession, having a sense of doctrine and identity and credentials and all the rest of that all makes a lot of sense. If that existed in emergency management, it should. But that was it. Anyway, so that's the one favor I've got to ask from you. is if you have a policy brief idea, put it together, send it to either these two fine people or send it to me. And the last thing I want to do is want to thank everybody. Kauser, Niru, MDAD, you did an amazing job. But really, this is perfect workshop. The metaphor I always use is they look like ducks. They're sailing along the water, but underneath the water, they're paddling furiously. And of course, the people who are really paddling furiously are the students who've helped make this possible. So I want to thank the students who've done all the heavy lifting so that these people don't have to sweat. And I want to thank the various partners. So I don't know how you say the CRRIC, is it CERC?
Creek.
What, Creek?
Yeah.
Creek. I like Creek, that's terrific. I want to thank Mines and SHRC for funding this CSN and for funding this. I want to thank all folks from Manitoba for being so welcoming. I've had a great time here, learning a lot, despite how wonderfully cold it happens to be. I want to thank all the speakers for sharing their expertise. We all learned a lot over the past day and a half. As I said, when we were building a CDSN, this is exactly the kind of thing we had in mind, to bring people from very different perspectives together. And so I'm very, very happy about this first workshop you guys organized. So thanks again. And if you want to find me, I'm easy to find. My email address is Stephen, Stephen, .Saidman, SAIDEMAN @carleton.ca, and everywhere on social media. And we'll be having a bunch of you folks on the podcast to talk about what you learned here and what you are doing. So listen about them and share the news of the CSN so that we can do more of this stuff in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Just a last part, and please bear with me for the another round of Thanksgiving. So thank you very much, Professor Steve, Professor Niru, and Professor Mdad for reposing your trust on Creek to organize the event. And I also in turn thank my volunteers, Sadman, Faria, then Rehnuma and Ruxar, because without them, it would have not been possible to organize in such a befitting way. And as I conclude, just to share one quick update from Creek is that I'm in touch with the Disaster Response Exercise Exchange. It's an event that happens in Bangladesh each year with a little bit of interruption during COVID. And in turn, I ended up with Wargaming Center in Bangladesh military because they are organizing such events almost regularly. And they use software which builds a lot of simulated exercises, and it is provided from France. And the group I'm talking to is called MASA. And very soon we are going to study the various scenarios. And with this connection, we have already submitted a proposal through CDSN to DND to sponsor exercise in next June. So hopefully if we are successful or not, but we look forward to have that opportunity open. And we would like to organize such a simulated exercise for 2 to 3 days here in Winnipeg. The basic idea of such an exercise is grounded on the issue of coordination. And you have heard from the speakers from yesterday and today, especially from General Tewarno, the questions of decision making. So that part of the exercise, we are going to focus basically on response system and coordination only. And before I formally conclude, we have the next workshop, as you see on the screen, coming up on March 16th and 17th. And it's going to happen in Royal Military Museum in Toronto, Ontario. And here are the dates. Please tune in our website and our social media feeds, and we'll put up the details very soon. And Professor Nirupama Agrawal is the host there, and we are working very closely with Professor Nirupama and her team to arrange this in a befitting way. So please join there. And finally, Professor Ankerson for traveling all the way, Professor Suba from Brandon, and Nate, not so far anyways, Winnipeg, but still you came and stayed with us. Thank you once again so much. And we look forward to meeting you and discuss with you matters related to disaster management response in the future. Have a safe rest of the day. And those who are flying back, please have our good wishes to your families and friends. Thank you once again for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kausar, for.
Yeah. Well, you have a entire life to keep learning and keep delivering later. Even now.
Hi everyone, one last thing, just can we gather for a group picture, please? Thank you.
Oh, okay, so yeah, but I'm saying
Gilbert, thank you very much. If you're still with us.
Yes, I'm still here.
Thank you, Gilbert. And just watch my email is coming to you very shortly, and I look forward to having you in Winnipeg. And I'll set up a meeting with Professor Imdad if you would like. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
and that notion of conceptual